In the remote hills of eastern Kentucky, where valleys are still embraced by a morning mist that feels untouched by time, there's a documented case from almost 2 centuries ago that continues to baffle historians. The year was 1834, and the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison, along with his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived at the isolated Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow, a place so cut off from the world that it was barely on maps of that era. The events of their 3-day stay were carefully chronicled in the private journal of Pastor William Phillips. This document, discovered in 1987 during the demolition of the old church, describes happenings so specific and unnaturally accurate that they have been extensively studied by modern psychologists. Yet, no one can explain how 2 young children could possess such knowledge that defies all logic. The Morrison twins didn't just foresee the future, they unearthed secrets buried for decades, described people they had never met, and spoke of tragedies that occurred years before their birth. Perhaps most unsettling of all, every single detail they revealed was later proven to be unquestionably and verifiably true. This channel is for a select few, those brave enough to confront mysteries that question the very nature of our reality. Before we delve into the Morrison case, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to uncover details that many historians choose to ignore. Also, let us know in the comments what state you're from, because what happened in Kentucky might have taken place much closer to home than you think. The story starts not with the supernatural, but with something far more disturbing, the possibility that some human minds can access information in ways that science still can't comprehend. Kentucky in 1834 was a land caught between the wild frontier and growing civilization, where communities like Pine Hollow existed in virtual seclusion among the Cumberland foothills. This particular settlement was founded in 1818 by 3 families seeking religious freedom away from the conflicts plaguing larger towns. By the time the Morrison family arrived, Pine Hollow was a community of barely 200 people, most of whom were connected by blood or marriage and lived under the strict Baptist doctrine that governed their daily lives. The community's hub was a simple wooden church, built by hand from timber harvested from the surrounding hills. Pastor William Phillips, an educated man who had left a comfortable life in Lexington to serve these frontier souls, maintained the only written records of births, deaths, marriages, and other significant events. His meticulous record-keeping would later prove essential in documenting the bizarre occurrences that were about to unfold. Ezekiel Morrison was a familiar presence among the circuit of remote churches scattered throughout the Appalachian region. Tall and weathered, with prematurely gray hair that hinted at hardships beyond his 34 years, he traveled on foot with his daughters. His only possessions were a worn leather satchel containing his Bible, a few personal items, and a journal for his spiritual reflections. He had been a widower for 9 years, ever since his wife, Sarah, died giving birth to the twins during a severe winter storm that had isolated their cabin for weeks. The girls, Rebecca and Rachel, were identical in appearance but opposite in personality. Rebecca, the firstborn by mere minutes, had an outgoing personality that instantly endeared her to people. Her smile was contagious, her laughter genuine, and she spoke with a confidence well beyond her years. Rachel, quieter and more observant, seemed to exist in her sister's shadow. Yet, those who watched closely noticed she would often start sentences that Rebecca would finish, or answer questions directed at her sister before Rebecca had a chance to reply. What made the Morrison family stand out among the traveling preachers was Ezekiel's reputation for bringing spiritual revival to struggling congregations. Stories followed them from church to church, tales of wayward members returning to their faith, of communities resolving long-standing feuds, and of spiritual awakenings that lingered for years after their departure. Some credited Ezekiel's passionate sermons, but those who observed more closely noticed the real transformations often began after the twins had private conversations with community members. The trip to Pine Hollow had been especially difficult. Late autumn rains had turned the mountain trails into treacherous mud, forcing Ezekiel to carry a feverish Rachel for the final 5 miles. They arrived at sunset on November 15, 1834, just as Pastor Phillips was finishing evening prayers with a handful of congregants who attended weeknight services. Phillips later wrote that his first impression of the family was one of deep weariness, not just physical but spiritual. Ezekiel's clothes were patched and worn thin from countless miles of travel. The girls clung to their father, Rachel was still pale from her fever, and Rebecca's usual vivacity was dimmed by exhaustion. Yet, Phillips felt a strange unease when he looked into their eyes. There was an alertness, an awareness, that seemed unnatural for children their age. The Pine Hollow congregation had welcomed many traveling preachers over the years, but there was something different about the Morrisons from the very beginning. That first evening, as they shared a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked the pastor's wife about her garden, specifically inquiring whether the roses by the eastern fence had recovered from the blight that had nearly destroyed them 3 summers prior. Mrs. Phillips dropped her spoon, staring at the child in disbelief. The rose blight had indeed occurred 3 years ago, but it was not something she had ever mentioned to anyone outside the immediate community. When asked how she knew, Rebecca simply smiled and said she had dreamed about roses while walking and somehow knew that Mrs. Phillips grew the most beautiful ones in the county. This incident, which Pastor Phillips recorded in his journal that same evening, was just the first of many that would challenge everything the Pine Hollow community believed about the natural world. The next morning was grey and cold, with a bitter wind rattling the windows of the small cabin where the Morrisons were staying. Pastor Phillips rose early, as was his custom, to prepare his sermon. He found Ezekiel already awake, sitting by the dying fire's embers. His Bible was open, but his eyes were staring into the distance with a look of deep concern. The girls had disturbing dreams last night, Ezekiel explained when Phillips asked about his troubled demeanor. They often dream of the places we're going to, but these dreams were different, darker. Before Phillips could respond, Rebecca appeared in the doorway. Her hair was disheveled from sleep, but her eyes were alert and focused. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childish voice, "in your church, beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar, there's something hidden that shouldn't be there. Rachel dreamed about it, and I dreamed about why it's hidden." A chill ran through the pastor that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had indeed hidden something beneath those exact floorboards, a bottle of whiskey that represented his ongoing struggle with temptation. No one knew about it. He had placed it there during a moment of weakness 3 months earlier, telling himself it was better to keep it close so he could resist it daily rather than remove the temptation entirely. It was a deeply shameful secret he had confessed only to God in his private prayers. "What exactly did you dream, child?" Phillips asked, his voice barely steady. Rachel emerged from the shadows behind her sister, moving with the peculiar silent grace that characterized her every action. "The bottle is brown," she said softly, "and it's wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a baby's blanket." "A blue blanket." Philip sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The cloth was indeed a remnant of a baby blanket, the blanket that would have belonged to the son he and his wife had lost in infancy 5 years earlier. He had wrapped the bottle in it as a reminder of his failures, both as a father who couldn't save his child and as a pastor who couldn't conquer his own weaknesses. Ezekiel watched his host's reaction with an expression that mixed sympathy with a weary familiarity. "It started when they were very young," he explained quietly. "At first, I thought it was just childish intuition, the way young ones sometimes sense things adults miss. But as they grew older, their insights became more specific, more impossible to explain through natural means." That Sunday service would be remembered by every member of the Pine Hollow congregation for the rest of their lives. Ezekiel's sermon was powerful, but not unusual for a circuit preacher, a passionate plea for spiritual renewal and confession of sins. It was what happened afterward that defied all rational explanation. As the congregation began to file out, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a prosperous farmer known for his generosity to the church and his respected standing in the community. She looked up at him with her innocent blue eyes and said, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection isn't really stealing if you put it back, is it? Papa says God forgives those who repent." The color drained from Turner's face. For 6 months, he had been skimming small amounts from the collection plate to cover debts from a failed business venture in Louisville. He had told himself he would replace every penny, but the missing money had been eating at his conscience like a cancer. Before Turner could respond, Rachel moved to stand beside her sister and addressed Martha Whitfield, the elderly widow who served as the church's unofficial moral authority. "Mrs. Whitfield," Rachel said, "your husband didn't die in that farming accident, did he? He's still alive somewhere, and that's why you hide the letters." The elderly woman swayed as if she might faint. Her husband had indeed abandoned her and their children 15 years earlier, taking their savings and disappearing one night without a word. She had fabricated the story of his accidental death to preserve her dignity and her children's future in the community. The letters Rachel mentioned were the occasional correspondence she received from him, pleading for forgiveness and describing his new life in Missouri. She had never spoken of them to anyone. One by one, the twins moved through the congregation, speaking quietly to various members. To Dr. Hayes, they mentioned patients who had died under his care due to his lack of proper medical training. To the Miller family, they spoke knowingly of the son they kept hidden in their attic, a young man whose simple mind made them ashamed before their neighbors. To young Thomas Brett, they described in detail his secret meetings with Elizabeth Carter, the married woman whose husband traveled frequently on business. Each revelation was delivered with childlike innocence, without judgment or malice, as if the girls were simply sharing observations about the weather. Yet the accuracy of their statements was so precise, so impossible, that the congregation stood frozen in a mixture of terror and awe. Pastor Phillips watched in horrified fascination as his orderly community was turned inside out by two 9-year-old children who spoke of secrets that should have been known only to God. But it was Rebecca's final statement that would haunt him for the rest of his days. She walked to the front of the church, stood before the altar, and placed her small hand on the wooden cross that had been carved by the church's founding members. "This is sacred ground," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent sanctuary, "but it's been stained by what happened here before." Her eyes met Pastor Phillips's. "The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor Phillips? They died right here in this very room. And some of you know exactly why." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind outside seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was waiting for someone to respond to this impossible accusation. The revelation about the Whitman family struck the congregation like a physical blow. Pastor Phillips, his face pale as morning frost, gripped the pulpit so tightly his knuckles went white. The Whitman tragedy was Pine Hollow's deepest secret, a wound that had never properly healed despite 16 years of collective silence. In 1818, when Pine Hollow was still a struggling settlement of barely 50 souls, the Whitman family had been among its most prominent members. Jacob Whitman served as both blacksmith and unofficial leader, while his wife Mary was known for her skill with herbal remedies and her gentle way with difficult births. Their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, had been the community's darlings, bright, beautiful 9-year-old girls who sang in the church choir and helped their mother tend to the sick. The official story, the one recorded in Pastor Phillips's predecessor's careful records, stated that the Whitman family had perished in a tragic house fire during a winter storm. Their bodies were supposedly found in their home's remains and they were buried in the church cemetery with the appropriate ceremony. The community mourned, rebuilt, and moved forward, as frontier communities were forced to do when tragedy struck. But Rebecca's statement suggested a far different reality, one that several of the older congregation members had hoped would remain buried forever. Elder Thompson, now 73 and one of Pine Hollow's founding families, slowly rose from his pew. His arthritis made movement painful, but his voice carried the weight of decades when he finally spoke. "Child," he said, his words measured and careful, "you speak of things that happened before you were born in places you've never been. How could you possibly know about what you claim to know?" Rebecca turned to face him, her blue eyes holding an unsettling maturity. "Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder," she said quietly. Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll that their father carved, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair inside. When they died, Faith was wearing her blue Sunday dress, and Hope was in her nightgown because she had been ill with fever. These details, impossible for a stranger to know, sent a murmur of recognition through the older members of the congregation. Elder Thompson's wife clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear and recognition. "The night they died," Rachel continued, her voice soft but clear, "it wasn't a house fire that killed them. They came to the church seeking sanctuary because someone was hunting them. They hid behind the altar, but they were found anyway. The church had grown so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed unnaturally loud." Pastor Phillips found himself remembering fragments of conversations he had heard over the years, whispered words that stopped when he entered a room, meaningful glances between the older members when certain topics arose, and the way some families always left flowers at an unmarked spot in the cemetery. Samuel Turner, still shaken by the earlier revelation about his financial transgressions, stood up abruptly. "This is madness," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "These children are speaking nonsense, making up stories to frighten us. There's no way they could know such things." But even as he spoke, other details began to emerge from the congregation. Mrs. Carter, Elizabeth's mother-in-law, whispered something about bloodstains that had appeared on the church floor years later, stains that couldn't be cleaned no matter how hard they scrubbed. Old Benjamin Foster mentioned the strange sounds that sometimes echoed from the church late at night, sounds like children crying that had been dismissed as wind through the loose boards. Dr. Hayes, despite his earlier embarrassment about his medical qualifications, found himself speaking up with clinical precision. "I've always wondered about the church's foundation," he said slowly. "When I helped repair the eastern wall 3 years ago, we found what looked like, well, what could have been bone fragments mixed with the original mortar." The implications of his statement hung heavy in the air. If the Whitman family had indeed died in the church, if their bodies had been secretly interred within its very foundations, then every service, every prayer, every moment of worship had taken place over their unmarked graves. Ezekiel Morrison had been standing silently throughout these revelations, his weathered face showing deep concern but no surprise. He had witnessed similar scenes in other communities, watching as his daughter's impossible knowledge unraveled carefully maintained lies and brought long-buried truths into the light. "Mr. Morrison," Pastor Phillips said, his voice strained, "how do your daughters know these things? What manner of gift allows them such insight?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of the congregation before responding. "I've asked myself that question every day for years," he finally said. Their mother, Sarah, claimed to have the second sight, the ability to sense things beyond normal perception. But what the girls experience goes far beyond anything Sarah ever demonstrated. They dream of places they've never seen, speak of people they've never met, and know details about events that occurred before their birth. He paused, looking at his daughters with a mixture of love and profound sadness. "At first, I believed it was a blessing, a divine gift that would help me minister to troubled souls. But over the years, I've begun to wonder if it's something else entirely. The knowledge they possess, it comes with a cost. They carry the weight of everyone's secrets, everyone's pain. They know things children should never have to know." As if summoned by their father's words, the twins moved to stand together at the front of the church. For the first time since their arrival, they looked truly like the children they were, small, vulnerable, and overwhelmed by the adult world swirling around them. "We don't choose what we see," Rebecca said, her earlier confidence replaced by a weariness that seemed far too old for her young face. "The dreams come whether we want them or not. We see what was, what is, and sometimes what will be." Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "The Whitman sisters visit our dreams sometimes. They want people to know what really happened to them. They want someone to remember them properly." The church fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of people grappling with concepts that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Some faces showed skepticism, others fear, and still others a dawning hope that perhaps death was not the final ending they had always believed it to be. Pastor Phillips found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his ministry. He could dismiss the twins' claims as a childish fantasy or a deliberate deception, preserving the community's carefully maintained stability. Or he could pursue the truth, no matter where it led, and risk destroying the very foundations upon which Pine Hollow had been built. The decision would have consequences that none of them could have anticipated. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Pine Hollow's narrow streets, Pastor Phillips was unable to concentrate on his usual evening prayers. The twins' revelations had shaken him to his core, not just because of their accuracy, but because they had forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding for years. He had arrived at Pine Hollow 5 years earlier, eager to serve God in the wilderness and to escape the theological controversies that plagued the more established churches in Kentucky's larger towns. His predecessor, Pastor Mariah Hayes, had left behind meticulous records of births, deaths, and significant events, but Phillips had always noticed gaps in the documentation from the settlement's earliest years. The winter of 1818, in particular, seemed oddly sparse in recorded details. There were entries about harsh weather, supply shortages, and the deaths of several elderly residents, but the Whitman family's tragedy was mentioned only briefly. Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, and their twin daughters Hope and Faith perished in a house fire on the night of December 21st. Their earthly remains were committed to the ground with appropriate Christian ceremony. What had always struck Phillips as strange was the lack of detail about such a significant event. Pastor Hayes had been thorough in his documentation of even minor incidents, yet the death of an entire family, particularly one as prominent as the Whitmans, had been recorded with unusual brevity. Determined to understand what the Morrison twins might have uncovered, Phillips began searching through the church's stored records with new eyes. Hidden beneath years of accumulated documents, he discovered a small leather journal he had never seen before. The pages were water-stained and fragile, but the handwriting was clearly Pastor Hayes's. What Phillips read by candlelight that night would change his understanding of Pine Hollow's history forever. The journal revealed that Pastor Hayes had been deeply troubled by the circumstances surrounding the Whitman family's death. According to his private notes, Jacob Whitman had discovered something disturbing about certain members of the community, something significant enough that he had demanded a public confession and reparation. The nature of the discovery wasn't clearly stated, but Hayes's entry suggested it involved financial impropriety and possibly worse. On the night of December 20, 1818, Jacob Whitman had apparently confronted several community leaders in a heated meeting that lasted until well after midnight. Hayes wrote of raised voices, accusations of theft and corruption, and threats of exposure that would destroy the reputations of some of Pine Hollow's most respected families. The final entry, dated December 22, was particularly chilling. The Lord forgive us all for what was done. Jacob and his family came to the church seeking sanctuary, but they were followed. I heard the children crying, then silence. When morning came, we found them as they had been left. Elder Thompson and the others insisted we must protect the community's future, that the truth would destroy us all. I have agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul. Phillips set down the journal with trembling hands. The implications were staggering. The Whitman family hadn't died in a house fire at all. They had been murdered in the church itself, and the community's leaders had conspired to cover up the crime. But how could the Morrison twins possibly know details that had been hidden for 16 years? How could they describe the children's clothing, their personal belongings, and their physical characteristics with such precision? His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at his door. Opening it, he found Rebecca standing in the moonlight, still wearing her simple dress but with her hair neatly braided as if she had been awake and preparing for something important. Pastor Phillips, she said in her clear, childish voice, you found Pastor Hayes's journal, didn't you? The one he hid behind the loose stone in the foundation. Phillips stared at her in amazement. He had indeed found the journal in that exact location, guided by a subtle draft that had led him to discover the loose stone. How did you know where to tell me to look? He asked. Faith showed me in a dream, Rebecca replied matter-of-factly. She said Pastor Hayes was a good man who was forced to do bad things. She wanted someone to know the truth. The casual way she spoke of receiving guidance from a long-dead child sent chills down Phillips's spine. Rebecca, he said carefully, what exactly do you see when you have these dreams? The child's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Phillips could see the burden she carried. We see everything, she said simply. Not just what happened, but why it happened. The men who killed the Whitman family didn't plan to hurt anyone. They just wanted Jacob to stay quiet about what he'd discovered. What had he discovered? Rebecca looked past him into the cabin, where he could see Rachel sitting by the window, staring out at the church cemetery. The money for the church building didn't come from donations, she said. Some of it was stolen from travelers passing through the valley. Jacob found out about it when he was asked to make horseshoes for horses that belonged to dead men. The pieces began falling into place in Phillips's mind. The early years of Pine Hollow had been marked by frequent reports of travelers disappearing along the mountain paths. Officially, these disappearances had been attributed to natural dangers, bears, falls, exposure to harsh weather. But if Jacob Whitman had discovered evidence that some travelers had been deliberately murdered and robbed? The church was built with blood money, Rebecca continued, a young voice carrying a weight of understanding that should have been impossible at her age. That's why faith and hope can't rest. Their blood was spilled on ground that was already cursed. Phillips found himself face to face with a truth more horrible than anything he had imagined. The church he had devoted himself to serving, the sanctuary where he had prayed for guidance and comfort, had been constructed with the proceeds of murder and had itself become the site of even greater violence. But even as he grappled with these revelations, a part of his mind remained analytical, questioning, how could he verify any of this? How could he distinguish between supernatural knowledge and an elaborate deception? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and from a source that would challenge every rational explanation he might have constructed. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Pine Hollow. As the Morrison family prepared for their departure, their planned 3-day stay having already been extended to accommodate Sunday's dramatic revelations, a lone horseman approached the settlement from the Eastern Trail. The rider was a man in his 50s, well-dressed in the manner of town folk, with a bearing that suggested education and authority. He introduced himself to Pastor Phillips as Thomas Brennan, a solicitor from Lexington who had been searching for information about events in Pine Hollow dating back to its founding years. "I represent the estate of one Marcus Webb," Brennan explained as he accepted Phillips's hospitality. "Mr. Webb died recently in Louisville, and among his effects, we found documents suggesting he had business dealings with this community in its early years. I'm attempting to trace the disposition of certain funds that may have been irregularly transferred." Phillips felt his blood run cold. Marcus Webb was a name that had appeared in Pastor Hayes's secret journal, one of several travelers who had disappeared along the mountain paths in 1818 and 1819. According to Hayes's notes, Webb had been carrying a considerable sum of money intended for land purchases in Tennessee. Before Phillips could formulate a response, Rebecca appeared at his elbow with that uncanny timing that characterized so many of her appearances. She looked up at Brennan with curious eyes and said, "Mr. Webb had a gold watch with his initials engraved inside the cover. It had a crack across the crystal because he dropped it when he fell from his horse." Brennan's composure cracked visibly. "How could you possibly know about Marcus Webb's watch?" he demanded. That detail was mentioned only in his personal correspondence with his brother. Rachel materialized beside her sister as if summoned by some invisible signal. "The watch is buried behind the church," she said quietly, "along with his money bag and his horse's bridle. Elder Thompson put them there after what happened on the trail." The implication struck Phillips like a physical blow. If the twins were correct, if Marcus Webb's personal effects were indeed buried behind the church, it would prove that their knowledge extended far beyond what any normal child could possess. More importantly, it would provide tangible evidence of the crimes that had funded Pine Hollow's early development. Brennan dismounted his horse with urgent purpose. "I demand that we excavate the area immediately," he declared. "If what these children claim is true, we're looking at evidence of robbery and murder." Elder Thompson, who had been observing the exchange from a distance, approached with obvious reluctance. At 73, he was the only surviving member of the original leadership council that had made the decisions in those early years. His weathered face showed a mixture of resignation and defiance. "You speak of things you don't understand, stranger," Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of age and position. "This community was built by God-fearing people who did what they had to do to survive in the wilderness." "Survival doesn't justify murder," Brennan replied sharply. "If these allegations are true, this entire settlement was founded on criminal acts." Rebecca looked up at Elder Thompson with those unsettling blue eyes that seemed to see far too much. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, "the nightmares stopped coming after the first year, didn't they? You told yourself that meant God had forgiven you." Thompson's facade crumbled visibly. "Child," he whispered, "you couldn't know about, no one knows about the dreams where Marcus Webb begged you to let him go," Rachel continued, her soft voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "About how you see his face every night before you fall asleep." The old man sank onto a nearby tree stump as if his legs could no longer support him. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "We only meant to take the money. We were starving. Our children were sick, and winter was coming." But Webb fought back, and then, his confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Pastor Phillips realized he was witnessing the unraveling of everything he had believed about his community, his church, and his faith. Ezekiel Morrison, who had been standing silently throughout these revelations, finally spoke. "The truth has a way of surfacing," he said quietly. "My daughters don't choose what they reveal. They're simply conduits for information that demands to be heard." Brennan wasted no time in organizing an excavation party. Within hours, several men from the community were digging behind the church, guided by the twins' precise directions. Pastor Phillips watched with growing dread, knowing that each shovelful of earth brought them closer to evidence that would destroy Pine Hollow's carefully constructed mythology. They didn't have to dig deep. 3 feet below the surface, their shovels struck something metallic. Carefully brushing away the soil, they uncovered a tarnished gold pocket watch. Its crystal was indeed cracked, just as Rebecca had described. The initials MWs were clearly visible inside the cover. Beside the watch lay a leather money bag, its contents long since deteriorated, but